I'm excited to welcome our guests here today. It's great to be able to talk about the new presidency in Korea and the political situation and the U.S. Republic of Korea relationship. We have two panelists. Gordon Flake was appointed the executive director of the Mike and Maureen Mansfield Foundation in February of 1999. He previously served as a senior fellow and associate director of the program on conflict resolution at the Atlantic Council of the United States, and was the director for research and academic affairs at the Korea Economic Institute of America. Flake travels frequently to Japan, Korea, China, and other countries in Asia, both as a conference participant and as a lecturer. He is a regular contributor on Korea issues in the U.S. and the Asian press. He's traveled to North Korea on 4 occasions, published extensively on policy issues in Asia. His most recent publication was titled Paved with Good Intentions, the NGO Experience in North Korea. That book examines the impact of NGO and UN humanitarian relief efforts in North Korea after 1995. He was born in New Mexico. He received a BA in Korean with a minor in international relations from Brigham Young University and completed a master's at the David M. Kennedy Center for International Studies at BYU. His master's thesis was on economic reforms in Laos. He's lived in Korea for a number of years. He speaks both fluent Korean and Laotian, and he and his wife are the proud parents of 7 children.
Well, thank you. It's a great honor to be back. When I was a student here at the Kennedy Center, it wasn't an undergraduate program at all. It was only a graduate program, and the majority of our meetings were around this round table in this room here. So this room holds many special memories for me. I also should put a little bit of context into this. When I returned from my mission, it's been 20 years ago now, but shortly, about 2 years after that, when Mark Peterson returned from his time as a mission president, I remember vividly sitting in a room with about 50 or so other returned missionaries who were gung-ho and wanted to do everything about Korea, and having Professor Peterson do his best to dissuade us from working on Korea. And he said something. He said, you know, if you really want to work on Korea, get a skill. Go out and learn engineering or English literature or something. You can go back to Korea and do stuff, he says, because he says, the market won't bear it. He says, only, 1 or 2% of you will actually be able to get a job being a Korea specialist, right? And I remember thinking, you can't tell me that, right? And just kind of rebelling as you might want to do at that age and think it's crazy. And now 20 years later, I look around at this, the core class that I was with and those people in the room with me, and I guess I'm the 1%. And I feel grateful for the career I've had at the Korea Economic Institute, Atlantic Council, elsewhere. It's allowed me to kind of focus and spend most of my career focusing on Korea, Japan, etc. I'm going to focus primarily on Korea-U.S. relations, which have gone through a real rocky patch recently. And to do so, I want to start off with a quote about Japan. The Mansfield Foundation, which I head up and which I've headed for the last 10 years, is named after former Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield. And you can be forgiven if you don't know who he is, because my dirty secret that my board of directors doesn't know is that I didn't know who he is before I took over the foundation. He was our longest-serving Senate Majority Leader, and then after that he was appointed to be Ambassador to Japan by Reagan, and Carter kept him on for 2 more terms. So for 12 years he was Ambassador to Japan, our longest-serving ever Ambassador to Japan as well. And while he was in Tokyo, he said over and over again, the U.S.-Japan bilateral relationship is the most important bilateral relationship in the world, bar none. He was from Montana, and so those of you from the West will understand that well. In fact, he said that so much it became a mantra, and they started calling the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo the Bar None Ranch, right? Now, as a Korea specialist, I would hear these types of statements about the primacy and the importance of the U.S.-Japan relationship, and I would kind of grouse and say, yeah, but the U.S.-Korea relationship is the best alliance relationship in the world, right? The alliance is, the motto of the U.S. Forces Korea is kachi kapshita, right? We have the only truly combined command between the U.S. and ROK. We have an alliance forged in blood. On the international arena, whether it's on trade issues, trade and liberation issues, Korea and the U.S. were always together, lockstep, right? If you look at conflict, Korea fought and shed tremendous blood. I think most people don't realize it in Vietnam. Much of the dirty work was done by Koreans in the Vietnam War, the first Gulf War. No matter what it was, the Koreans and the Americans were clearly one of the closest alliances we had in that period of time. And yet, fast forward to 2002, you have anti-American demonstrations flowing over in the streets, candlelight vigils, right? You have Secretary Rumsfeld in America that's post-9/11, very sensitive ourselves, saying, if they don't want us there, get our boys out of there. He actually used colorful language is not appropriate at BYU in describing that, And then you have this general sense in the United States where, in contrast to the anti-Americanism in Korea that Professor Ringer focused on for his dissertation, I became increasingly concerned about anti-Korean sentiment in Washington. Because again, you have a post-9/11 America that's very sensitive, you're with us or you're against us, and all of a sudden there's a lot of harsh anti-American words coming out of Korea in this environment, and the environment became shaken dramatically. So I think it's to realize that the last 5 years represent a really rough time for U.S.-Korea relations, to the point where, at least on a political level, the alliance itself was drawn into great question in Washington, D.C. I mean, if you put the alliance to a vote in, say, 2003 or 2004, before the U.S. Congress, it would not have passed in terms of the alliance, right? It was a really shaky time on a political level, right? So let me talk a little bit about why that is, what happened, how we got there, to have this genuine political crisis. Then I'll spend most of my time focusing on where we're going under Im Young-bak. But it's important to understand the crisis to understand our pending emergence from that crisis. First and foremost, rather than trying to lay this at the feet of any individual, someone like President Roh Moo-hyun, who was elected in 2002, the real problem was much more systemic than that, right? The U.S. ROK Alliance was forged on a common threat perception of North Korea. It was born of the Korean War. It was born of the Cold War. It was born of the North Korean invasion of South Korea. And as such, that common threat perception of North Korea was the foundation for the alliance. And as you might imagine, after 10 years of sunshine policy towards North Korea, South Korean threat perceptions about North Korea continued to drop. And in a post-9/11 world, when the United States is worried about nuclear weapons, the proliferation of nuclear weapons and materials and technologies, a country like North Korea that's on the state sponsors of terrorism list, U.S. threat perceptions regarding North Korea went up. So you cannot have an alliance where your core alliance is diverging in terms of threat perception and not have that affect the relationship itself. So that was kind of the underpinning thing. Secondly, you had a real generational shift taking place in South Korea. With Roh Moo-hyun in 2002 was a wave of younger voters, an emergent civil society in South Korea, led primarily by a generation which was called the 386 generation, the Sampayuk Sedae, which was named after those who were in their 30s at the time, who were educated, went to college in the 80s, were politically active in the 80s, and were born in their 60s, right? And then there was also the computer joke that they cut their teeth on 386 computers, right? And now, of course, we say they're the Pentium generation, right? Because they're all in their 40s, their 486s, and et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, this group had been the group that had been largely responsible for Korean democratization in the 1980s. They had a deep anti-American tint because they viewed the Americans as being supportive of the South Korean dictators, resistant to their efforts to democratize the country. And, they had that basic outlook to begin with. And then on top of that, just with the generation coming into power and those anti-American sentiments, you had a couple of very unfortunate things. For example, in the summer of 2002, while the World Cup was going along, there was a very unfortunate accident where an American military vehicle on training ran over and killed 2 young Korean schoolgirls, right? And that kind of sat fallow for a while, but the American military mishandled it in terms of the timing and the way the trial itself went about, and South Korean politicians decided to utilize this as part of their politics domestically in South Korea. And the result was that, as a surprise to many people, probably first among them Roh Moo-hyun, in December of 2002, President Roh Moo-hyun and that young generation of political activists, won the presidency. And they won it on a wave of anti-American sentiment at a time which was very sensitive in the alliance itself. And so it really was a difficult time in terms of the relationship. I would add one caveat to this, though. This is important not to view Korea in a bubble, right? If you look at that same period of time, there was anti-American sentiment among populations around the entire world, right? So Korea wasn't uniquely anti-American. This was the whole Iraq War initiation phase, et cetera, and you should put it in that context. Now, having set that as the context, let me start off by saying something that might be a little bit controversial. I actually think that the Roh Moo-hyun administration did more for U.S.-Korean relations than any other administration in U.S.-Korean history, right? And it's very counterintuitive because in many respects, I tried to like Roh Moo-hyun for 3 years, but he was extremely inept in many ways, right? But if you look at what was actually done, if you look at the policies rather than the pronouncements, It's remarkable what happened during the tenure of the No administration. And a large part of this isn't because of President No. It's because of the hard work that was done at the State Department, in the South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs, real difficult negotiations between their Defense Department and our Defense Department. But just to give you an example, they negotiated very difficult status of forces agreements, very sensitive things. They renegotiated the removal of the U.S. military presence from downtown Seoul, to south of the Han River to a place called Pyeongtaek, right? They negotiated something extremely sensitive, the transfer of wartime operational control, from U.S. forces to South Korean forces, right? They proposed and successfully negotiated a free trade agreement, a historic free trade agreement between the United States and Korea. So on a substantive level, the hard issues were addressed head on, worked on hard for 5 years and done well. So why the problem? The problem was that there was this real imbalance between the political base, of Roh Moo-hyun and the necessities of what he did. I forgot to add on to that. They deployed troops to Afghanistan. They had the third largest contingent in Iraq after only the U.S. and Great Britain, right? They deployed troops to Lebanon, and so in every way, South Korea was still there in terms of it. So why the problem? Why wasn't that recognized? A couple of factors. One is relative expectations. Going back to the Mansfield quote I just mentioned about Japan, our expectation, and this was largely part of South Korea's fault, they all wanted to, always competing with the Japanese to set the expectation higher, that they're better and do more than the Japanese. For 30 years, the U.S. would say Japan's our most important ally, but had very low expectations for the Japanese. Because of the sensitivities about their constitution and their history, they did almost nothing in terms of a military cooperation level, alliance level. It was kind of, we can't do this, and we accepted that, right? On the Korean side, it's kachikapsta, let's do it, right? No question, right? 하면 된다, right? No problem, right? And then all of a sudden you have this period of time where, believe it or not, the Japanese have boots on the ground in Iraq before the Koreans do. Shock, right? Yeah, and so you have this period of time when Bush, 2002, 2003, cannot give an international speech without praising his buddy Koizumi and how wonderful the Japanese are, because the Japanese on every way exceed expectations. They deploy a refueling mission to the Indian Ocean to help the mission in what's going on in Afghanistan. They have troops on the ground in Iraq, which is just unthinkable, right? Whereas Korea, despite the fact that it's the third largest contingent, continues to undermeet expectations, right? They it was a long, difficult process. It was a year later when they finally send troops. And Roh Moo-hyun, when he announces it, says, yes, we're sending troops, but we're only doing this because the U.S. promised to change their policy in North Korea. He doesn't mention the alliance, doesn't put it in the right context. And unfortunately, in politics, words matter. And the words, didn't match with the actions. And it caused a real gap in terms of relative expectations between the two, which hurt the problem there. And then the second major problem associated with that is something I mentioned at a lunch we had with some of the professors today, and that is that in democratic societies, we like to think that we want our politicians to be honest and straightforward. We like the straight talk express, right? Don't lie to us. Tell us the truth. We want transparency, right? Well, Roh Moo-hyun is living proof that there is such thing as too much transparency, right? This is a man who was not sophisticated. He's, again, as mentioned in the previous panel, he's a rags to riches kind of bootstrap kind of story. He passed the Korean law exam, which only 2% of applicants passed without ever going to law school, right? Became a labor lawyer, kind of just really remarkable guy, very smart, but not very sophisticated, right? Particularly not in the ways of politics. And as a result, he said whatever he thought, whenever he thought it. And as a result, he was constantly undermining his own policies. So deploy troops, but say, we really didn't want to do it, and it's only because you've agreed to be soft on North Korea, right? And repeatedly saying things like, I've been a bad president. I wish I hadn't sent troops to North Korea. Maybe I should resign. And it's just, remarkable transparency in that process. Calls for him, South Korea to play a balancing role. Criticism of people who criticize him as being more Americans than the Americans, right? Things that just kind of really sounded wrong to the American ear. So, and the problem was he is tacking to his political base, in his words and his dialogues, even though his actions are good. But that kind of disconnect really served to undermine the trust in the relationship and to greatly foment the kind of the political angst in Washington, D.C. in regards to South Korea. Now, if you look at Im Young-bak, one thing that I think was not said in the morning panel, I think his election was largely much more about an anti-Noh Moo Hyun vote than it was a pro-Im Young-bak vote, right? This was a vote against an extremely ideological, extremely inconsistent, extremely kind of up and down, tumultuous period of time, and a vote for a pragmatic, let's get it done kind of approach, right? And so in many respects, the Koreans say that Im Young-bak is a very lucky guy, right? I mean, everything has kind of fallen in place for him in terms of his career, a lot of different things, and among those is the election. I mean, the notion is that he would not have been elected had he not followed Noh Moo Hyun. And in that same regard now, when it comes to U.S.-Korean relations, Im Young-bak is a remarkably lucky guy because he doesn't have to do anything. If you look at the hot issues on the table, what Im Young-bak needs to deal with, does he need to negotiate a status of forces agreement? No, it's been done. Does he need to negotiate the removal of the 8th Army? No, it's been done. What about the controversial wartime operational control? No, it's been done. What about the free trade agreement? No, it's been done. So there are no major outstanding hot controversies between the U.S. and Korea right now. There's a few things we got to work on, and a few of the things I mentioned, there's progress needed, but in the end, all Im Young-bak has to do is say the right things. So whereas Noh did the right things but said the wrong things, Im Young-bak can come in and just say the right things. And so far, in his campaign and in his first weeks in office, he has done exactly that. And his foreign minister and prime minister and national security advisor have all done that. And so Washington right now is in quite of an Im Young-bak swoon. They like him. He's coming to Washington next week. There'll be a big, he's going to Camp David, which, as you might imagine, if you're not in Washington, you don't play this game, but foreign leaders coming to Washington, if you get invited to go to Crawford, Texas, that's like gold standard. That's the best thing you can get, right? If you get invited to Camp David, that's great, right? That's even better than a state dinner or something there. Then you get a state visit, then you get an official visit. You rank how cool you are based on what kind of treatment you get from the White House. But Noh Moo Hyun never got invited to either Camp David or, of course, not to Crawford, right? But so Im Young-bak coming at this time is given this honor, and he's going to have a nice, big public dinners, a lot of big meetings. Again, but at the same time, there's not an awful lot of expectation as to what's going to actually be done in terms of that process. And maybe our colleague from the State Department will list some of the specifics that need to be done, I presume. But in a broader political level, I don't see that as being the case. Now, here's my great angst around this process. I think that we have arguably the most pro-U.S. administration in a generation, at least, in South Korea. And the great tragedy is that there's nobody at home in Washington to take advantage of it. We have no senior Asia specialists left in the United States government. They're gone. People at a senior level who are committed to Asia, focused on Asia, interested in Asia. I'll just give you an example. Previously, we had Richard Armitage as Deputy Secretary of State, a known Asia specialist, very much focused on our alliance. The Assistant Secretary of State was Jim Kelly, again, long-term Asia specialist. In the White House, Mike Green, and then Victor Cha, both Senior Director for Asia and the Director for Asia in the National Security Council. At Commerce Department, Frank Lavin, long-term Asia specialist. In the Department of Defense, Dick Lawless, Richard Lawless, all strong political Asia specialists. Now, there's still people in these posts, right? And some of them are much more junior, some of them not Asia specialist, not focused, but on a political level in terms of political clout, there's no one that's saying, hey, this is important. Look at this great chance. Let's do something with Korea right now. In fact, in my last 2 trips to Korea, my message to the Im Young-bak administration was to do nothing. Because if you look at it, some of the contentious issues where you might want to move, missile defense. We've been hoping the South Koreans would join Japan and others in missile defense for a long time. My advice to the Koreans was don't do it because, 1, Washington's not paying attention to it right now. 2, you don't know who the next president is. And so you just got to wait and find out what the attitude of the next president is before you move. Secondly, another example, Proliferation Security Initiative. I don't know how much of you paid attention to this, but this was really kind of a Bob Joseph, John Bolton kind of idea in terms of international cooperation on a voluntary basis to stop the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, missiles, et cetera. There's 8 categories of cooperation. South Korea actually technically is already doing 5 of the 8, right? But would never join PSI, what they call it, the Proliferation Security Initiative, under the Noh Moo Hyun administration because they didn't want to offend the North, right? And so now Im Young-bak could come in and they could do it really easily. And so a lot of the early talk in the transition team was, let's join PSI to show the Americans how good friends we are right now. And my advice to them was, don't do it. because I haven't heard anyone in Washington, let alone someone in the State Department, mention PSI at this point, right? Wait until you're being asked, wait until it's an issue, because otherwise all you're going to do is anger your own left constituency in South Korea and the North Koreans, and you'll get no political benefit out of it whatsoever, right? And for me, the greatest tragedy of all is the free trade agreement. Here we have the most significant and meaningful free trade agreement since NAFTA, something that by every economist's assessment is good for the United States economy, right? Again, it's been negotiated, it's been agreed to on both sides. All that remains now is to be ratified in Seoul and ratified in Washington, D.C. And a number of us in December and January, in KEI in particular, was pushing really hard to work to ratify the Korea-U.S. FTA. And our advice in January to President Lee Myung-bak was, come to Washington. Don't try to sell the free trade agreement as an economic deal. Sell it in the context of the alliance. Say, with your ally. We're in Afghanistan and Lebanon, in Iraq, right? And we have negotiated this good faith. We ratified it. You ratify it. And our vision was that he would come and he would have resolved the beef issue, and Max Baucus would let him give a joint speech to the Senate and the House together. And in that context, there would be a big love fest. It would be part of the alliance, and it would pass, right? Boy, January seems like a long time ago. There's been several things that have happened. Number one, Ohio. The race to the bottom for the two Democratic candidates, right? Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama saying, I hate trade. No, I hate trade worse than you do. Free trade is bad. And they're going back and forth to the point where they're both calling to renegotiate the North American Free Trade Agreement, much to the angst of our Canadian and Mexican neighbors, right? They're both saying they would have no new free trade agreements. Both Obama and Hillary Clinton have come out formally against the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. Again, part of this trying to appeal to the voters in Ohio and also now in Pennsylvania as this process drags on and on and on. So I, for one, really wish that Super Tuesday had been a little bit more super and we could have avoided this type of thing. But the reality is we have a point right now where, without naming him, there are a number of core U.S. senators who have said straightforward, I cannot vote for this at this time in this environment. Free trade is poisonous, right? And so if you're a Democrat, you're not going to vote for it at this point. In fact, one of the again, most shocking things to me that happened in the last month was clear message being given to the South Korean embassy that is, do not ask for a joint speech, because even if you're given a joint speech or a speech to the joint session of the Congress, it will be given under the condition you don't mention the FTA. And again, this was going to be the one thing that Lee Myung-bak could do for the alliance right now, right, in terms of passing the free trade agreement and getting that ratified. And then on top of that, the more complicating factor is Colombia, right? And Colombia, I don't know how closely you've been following this in the media in the last week or so, but we've had a real kind of head-to-head match between the president and the Congress on this, where the president exercising his right under the fast-track authority to force the Congress to take a vote, and Congress basically saying, well, we're going to change the rules and push it off to after the election. But Colombia, whether it passes or not, has completely muddied the waters, got everybody on both sides extremely angry. So I'm not aware of a single person at this point who thinks that the FTA has any chance of passing this year. And so now we're worried that Koreans will take our advice and put this in the context of the alliance and come push it hard, and then it fails. And then that becomes a real problem. Here we've said, we're your ally, we've done all this, this is a national security issue, and if we don't pass it on the U.S. side, it can have very long-term implications for how South Korea perceives us, whether we're a worthy partner or a worthy ally in that regard. And so we're trying to backtrack as fast as possible to get people to put it off until next year, come up with a strategy for preparing for either a McCain administration, which actually could be worse, because although he's very free trade, you're still going to have a Democratic Senate and House who are angry as can be at once again being thwarted in their attempt to get the White House and not in any mood to compromise on anything on trade, let alone give fast-track authority, which is expired in that regard, right? And then on if it's Obama, right, he's got a very difficult time, because the longer the campaign goes on, the more the anti-trade rhetoric gets up, the more difficult it is to backtrack on that regard. So there's a real challenge that's kind of lying ahead. I have one other concern I'll put out, and then I'll kind of wrap up my remarks there too. And that is, we haven't talked a lot about North Korea, and in some ways, that's a wonderful relief. In the majority of the hundreds, if not thousands, of speeches I've given in the last 10 years, the real sexy topic is always North Korea, North Korea, North Korea. And I'm actually happy to be in a panel when people are actually focusing on some of the core alliance issues and economic issues rather than just the sexy topic of the day, because the reality is very little changes on that front. It's sensational, but nothing much happens. And if you look at it, that's exactly what's beginning to happen in South Korea. It's remarkable that despite what was described in the earlier panel as a very sharp escalation in North Korean rhetoric in the last couple of weeks, North Korean military flights close to the DMZ, North Korean test files, short and medium-range missiles, the South Korean response was, it didn't affect the elections. It wasn't an issue. Wasn't an issue in the presidential elections in any meaningful way. Wasn't an issue in the National Assembly elections this week. The people haven't responded. Im Young-bak's response has been, we're still ready to deal with you. We haven't changed our basic approach to engagement. Come back when you're ready. And I think it's a very adult, very measured response, which bodes well. My concern lies, however, in the ongoing talks related to the six-party talks related to North Korea's nuclear program. We have, and here I'll probably differ most greatly from my State Department colleague, we have a very ambitious, extremely intelligent Assistant Secretary of State named Christopher Hill, who himself calls himself often not the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, but the Assistant Secretary of State for North Korean negotiations, right? Who has made his entire career and focus at this point, right, about getting this nuclear deal with North Korea. And has really put heart and soul into this for 2 years. I personally am deeply skeptical of his negotiating methods and motives, to tell you the truth, and am really worried that he'll pull out some type of a deal that's a deal for a deal's sake, so he can say, I've accomplished something, I'm going home right now. And that right now, as we have a quick reversal going on in South Korea, that deal won't be adequately coordinated or consulted with South Korea. Because it's clear to me what North Korea is doing right now is once again going back to the tried and true tactics of trying to divide the U.S. from South Korea. Traditionally, it was called wedge driving tactics, right? So harsh rhetoric on South Korea, but trying to make up with the United States. And I think now more than any other period of time, it is essential that the U.S. and South Korea have extremely close alliance, communication, and coordination in every step of this process to make sure that any agreement or non-agreement that comes out is something that actually puts us or binds us closer together rather than drives us apart. And that goes not only for South Korea, but also for Japan, Russia, and China, the other parties in the six-party talks. But that's just something that, again, I have anxiety about it, but it's out there and it's something that those of you who are interested in the issue probably should continue to watch. Let me end with an advertisement. I have a few copies up here that I'll give to Professor Ringer. You can talk to him afterwards. But the Mansfield Foundation just did a quick and dirty book on U.S.-Korea relations called Understanding New Political Realities in Seoul, working towards a common approach to strengthen U.S.-Korea relations. And so after the election, we just got quick 5 papers on everything from the free trade agreement to Northeast Asian Peace and Security Mechanism to the alliance itself to policy towards North Korea, and then had 5 different sessions where we got experts to give feedback on it and did a quick edit and quick publication, got it out before the inauguration. The entire book's available online at the Mansfield Foundation website, which I'm happy to give you a link to. And I have a few copies that I'll leave with Professor Ringer for those of you who are really interested in kind of get a on-the-ground snapshot of what's going on right now politically. But thank you all. I appreciate it.
Seems to me on a very simple level, which is usually the level I like to think on, if we think about the alliance between the United States and South Korea, some of the main goals that both parties agree to would be peace, prosperity, and security. But it seems to me that we need to dig a lot deeper than that to really understand that alliance, and hopefully maybe we can start our discussion now, and we'll go until about 3:45. You've talked about some of the things that Korea and the United States have seemed to align their interests on. So the status of forces agreement, for example, they worked that out. The free trade agreement is another issue that they seem to have worked out. But it seems to me we still need to ask the question, what is it that each of these two parties wants to get out of these relationships? And what will it take for them to align their interests to the point where, in the free trade agreement, for example, it's actually passed? There are a number of other issues. North Korea, I know, is the exciting one, but I can't resist a little bit of that. How does South Korea and the United States address issues like food aid to North Korea? How does it address issues like human rights and promoting human rights, not just in North Korea, but in Asia in general? If the United States is going to have a presence in Asia now and in the future, and if South Korea is the primary partner that will help it achieve that, then what strategies do they need to pursue to promote human rights? China and the Olympics is the big one in the news right now, but there are certainly other issues in regard to that. How does North Korea or South Korea and the United States coordinate their foreign policy and use aid as a foreign policy tool? Is that a possibility, or I think that the Bush administration in general has been accused of going it alone, and I'm not sure that that's an unfair characterization of the Bush administration. There are a number of other things, but I think that question of the future of this alliance in terms of interests and in terms of getting those interests aligned is something that maybe we should discuss for a minute, and then we'll open it to the audience.
When I take a first crack at it, please. It is useful to step back and look at a very broad level in terms of aligning interests. On a fundamental level, if you look at South Korea's position in the region, as a relatively small nation located between China and Japan, two countries in which they have, at least in South Korea, considerable anxiety about rising nationalism in those two countries, there is an inherent logic for South Korea to ally itself with the United States. A strong superpower far away that doesn't have any territorial designs on the Korean Peninsula in terms of balancing off China, Russia, et cetera, Japan in that regard. Furthermore, if you begin to look beyond just the negative, the anti-North Korea concern about our security region, if you look at the common values, it's my position that there is no country in East Asia today that is more closely aligned to the United States, with the United States on values than South Korea. The sheer numbers and percentage of South Koreans who go abroad, particularly to the United States for graduate degrees and PhDs, is stunning, particularly when you compare it with China and Japan, especially on a per capita basis, right? The tremendous emergence of a vibrant civil society in South Korea, unmatched anywhere else in the region, in terms of that very open, free, debate in terms of think tanks and various other advocacy organizations and the free press. Again, unmatched even in a long-standing democracy such as Japan, really mean that. And then now 1.5 to probably 2 million Korean Americans, and those strong cultural ties that go back and forth between that, which would, I agree, be greatly facilitated by a visa waiver program, all seem to call for me to have that, to have a fundamental values-based kind of alliance in addition to that. There is, of course, some real fundamental concerns. China. How do we deal with the emergence of China? And South Korea, particularly for the last 5 years, has been doing a lot of hedging. They're worried that if the U.S. alliance is not going to be around, can they afford to anger the Chinese? There's been a lot of angst in the U.S. about South Korea slipping back into a much more traditional Chinese orbit, in terms of its history. At Japan, if there's one issue, and I've been involved in 6 or 7 different Korea task force over the last year, there's one common issue in every single one of those. It is the essential nature of U.S., Japan, South Korea trilateral coordination and cooperation. And that sounds perfectly logical from here, but if you look at it in Korea's perspective and Japan's perspective, in Korea, the people institutionally, academically, intellectually, and organizationally who work on Korea-U.S. relations are different than the people who work on Korea-Japan relations. They're divided in every way, right? And the same thing is true in Japan. But if you look at the U.S., the same people who work on Korea are the same people who work on Japan, right? You cannot, from a U.S. alliance perspective, and you talk about the future of the alliance, you cannot talk about the future of the U.S.-Japan alliance without thinking about Korea. They're a synergetic whole. They go together, right? Likewise, you cannot imagine a U.S. ROK alliance that's not based on a vibrant U.S.-Japan alliance. The two are tied in together. And yet we divide them up in these hermetically sealed, kind of vacuum-packed, separate things in the dialogue, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. So that just seems to me to be a key area where, particularly over the last 5 years, when we've had, a really worsening Korea-Japan relationship for a lot of different reasons, and a refusal, largely on South Korea's part, to engage in trilateral coordination, cooperation, or even communication. And that's one area Lee Myung-bak has promised to improve and has greatly improved. Very, very briefly on food aid and human rights. This is an area where you've had a dramatic change, whereas there was essentially no conditionality in food aid under the previous administration. In fact, Most of us in Washington jokingly called the Ministry of Unification in South Korea the Ministry of Anti-Unification, because their real job was to prop up the North Korean regime. And they were far more concerned about the North Korean system than the North Koreans were. And they were like, ooh, how can we help you? Please let us give you food. And that was an ongoing basis. And the only exception to that was a 6-month period after the nuclear test itself, until we essentially let them go. On food aid, Lee Myung-bak has indicated that he's going to give it to them. But after this most recent temper tantrum in the North Koreans have said, essentially, we will not let you help us unless you apologize to us first. And so Lee Myung-bak has said, sure, well, we're ready. When you're come ask and we'll give it to you. And they're kind of holding off right now. And the North Koreans have now gone to ask the Chinese for aid. But this could be another issue that would bear close watching in the coming months, because there's a lot of signs out there that North Korea could be once again slipping into a pre-famine, if not a famine state like they were back in the 1990s, based, if nothing else, on just basic grain shortfalls and the fact that the international appeals aren't being met. There's no other sources. The U.S. isn't giving it, and the South Koreans aren't giving it. And if the Chinese don't, what do we have there? The final point on human rights, and I won't go too much into this, but South Koreans have really been, I think personally, kind of gutless on this. They've been essentially what we call more Catholic than the Pope, right? So worried about offending the North Koreans, they don't want to do anything that would be perceived to be offensive to the North Koreans. Despite the fact that every other country in the world condemns North Korean human rights, South Koreans didn't think that was appropriate, right? And so they would not vote in the United Nations when the UN Human Rights Commission voted to condemn North Korean human rights. And the Lee Myung-bak administration has already done that and pledged to continue to do that. And so they're, in this one area now holding North Korea to a global standard. And yet at the same time, and I agree with Professor Peterson here, very pragmatic about being willing to continue engagement on that front. So,
you both mentioned the moving of the troops farther south, returning over wartime command to the Korean military. How much of that do you think is concessions to, or admitting that the Korean military is mature enough now, and how much of it is our trying to draw down troop strength so we can reserve it for the war in Iraq?
I'll start, and you may have comments there. Just to clarify one thing you said earlier, the transfer of wartime operational control, which is due to take place in 2012, it will likely be postponed, to tell you the truth. I don't think it's going to actually happen on that date. Is not the control over the South Korean armed forces, which they have on a day-to-day basis. And the truth is they probably would have in wartime anyway. We've still maintained a structure, which is a combined forces command, under which, in the event of hostilities, the U.S. would assume control over all armed forces on the Korean Peninsula, right? And so, as you might imagine, this is a very natural development, that as South Korea has grown in its own capacity and its own ability, it is a natural thing for South Korea to assume that role and that function. It's very sensitive, of course, as you might imagine, because the United States, no matter where we are in the world, is not very eager, with the exception of maybe NATO, but even then, very rarely, to put our armed forces under the command of somebody else. We're the superpower. We just don't do that kind of thing, right? And as a result, the notion of just transferring it straight forward led to some real troubles, and it's essentially led to us to move to disband or take apart the combined forces command, which in some ways I actually find kind of sad. In a time when Japan and U.S. forces are moving to a more joint position, in Korea we're kind of moving away from, which is a truly combined command in that regard. It's kind of like saying you're divorcing, but you still like each other and you'll still take care of the kids, don't worry, we'll still have the capacity, but we're still not quite there the same, right? Now, on the other hand, again, I understand this is a very natural and laudable development. And to highlight a point that I made during my remarks, this is a perfect case where this could have been a wonderful strengthening exercise for the alliance, where the South Koreans could have said, we've matured, we've great, thank you for your wonderful help. We've done this. Instead, when Roh Moo-hyun presented this, he says, as a matter of sovereignty, we're going to take back wartime operational control from the Americans. And as you might imagine, the perspective in Washington is, take back? When did we steal this from you? Yeah? And when are you depriving you of your sovereignty? Do you remember the context in which this took place, et cetera, right? It was cast in a very anti-American, very kind of tacking towards his political base kind of manner that really made it a lot more problematic than it really needed to be. It could have been a much more positive experience. The Lee Myung-bak administration and the GNP came in promising to block this, promising to demand a rollback of the date, saying it's not going to happen. And they've been mollified right now because internal to the transfer of wartime operational control process, there's a self-evaluation process built in where if they're not ready, it'll be delayed automatically. And I think based on that, they've been mollified, decided not to push forward very much. But in the end, I think this is not driven primarily by Iraq, but more broadly driven by the United States Global Posture Review, by the United States saying, look, we don't want to have a 1950s posture in South Korea where we're sitting there with heavy armored infantry divisions, exactly where we were 50 years ago, when all around the rest of the world we're moving to a situation under the Global Posture Review where we want smaller, more mobile forces, near transportation nodes that can get out and move quickly. Because in the end, the notion that the U.S. infantry would play any major role in this, or our armor division play any role in it, as we did previously, is kind of missing the way wars are fought this day and every other lesson we've learned for the last 10 years. So it doesn't make sense in this context. So it's really driven more by that in my mind than Iraq per se, or by, and in addition, a recognition that South Korea has kind of matured to that point.
What's your prognosis for the next president? What do you know about the Obama or McCain or Hillary camp and their views toward North Korea and South Korea? The reason I ask is, if you're North Korea, you got it made. You got one leader, you know what the policy is. I mean, they've had two leaders since Roosevelt. We've had how many, 13, 14, 15 presidents during that period of time that they've had to interact and deal with. And how do they, the North Koreans, deal with, now we've got a democracy in South Korea. Here they have Roh Moo-hyun and Kim Dae-jung, who are their buddies. Now all of a sudden they got Kim Young-bak, and they've got to deal with a different kind of a president. And then with the American side, they had a deal with Clinton. And Madeleine Albright goes over and visits. Then Bush comes in and pretty well makes a mess of it. I mean, Donald Gregg, Bush Sr.'s ambassador to South Korea, has nothing kind to say about George W. Bush's policy toward Korea. He says he just absolutely made a disastrous mess of it. And here at the end of the Bush administration, he's put together a deal that's exactly the same as the Clinton deal. I mean, State Department folks can say, well, here or there a little bit different, but if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. It's a duck. It's the same deal. So what prospect do we have that the new administrations that are going to make a mess of things again, like the Bush administration?
I'll start once again. And one of the phrases that I learned, the concepts I learned in this room 20 years ago was the old political science axiom that only Nixon could go to China. Right? And if, for those of you who haven't heard that, it means that if Kennedy or Johnson or a liberal Democrat tried to normalize relations with communist Red China, they would have been pilloried, crucified politically for having been soft on communism, soft on the Chinese communists, right? Whereas someone who is hard-driven anti-communist like Nixon could, right? If you look at the last 8 years, North Korea has consistently crossed every single red line that was established by the Clinton administration. Not only have they, reprocessed the spent fuel rods at Yongbyon, begun the reactor, kicked out IAEA inspectors, tested a nuclear weapon, fired long-range missiles, but now apparently, and we're likely to get a confession out of this, they've actually done the one unthinkable thing. They've proliferated nuclear technology, helped the Syrians build a plant, right? They've done everything. And what has been the Bush administration's response? Don't worry, we're solving this in 6-party talks. We're on it. Don't worry. And the Congress has accepted it. Yeah. Now, had this been a Gore administration or a Kerry administration, they would have been all over them, particularly Republicans in the Congress in this regard, right? And so I think people in Washington recognize clear that a Democratic president, whether it's Obama or Clinton, has a lot less wiggle room on these issues than does Bush. I mean, because Bush is, the current version of that is only Bush can ignore North Korea. Yeah? Only someone with his credentials saying, I loathe Kim Jong-il. Kim Jong-il's a pygmy, right? He says things of, axis of evil, right? He says this, but in terms of action, what have we done? Yeah? And he can get away with it because of that dynamic there, right? I don't think either Clinton or an Obama would have that leeway. If you look at the three candidates we've got right now, McCain has been consistently very hardline on North Korea. Very, very hardline in his statements. And if you look at the people around him, relatively conservative, more akin to the first part of the Bush administration and much more critical right now of the current approach by Chris Hill. So it's people like Rich Armitage, Randy Shriver, Mike Green, who are in that group right now. Clinton's camp right now, to be honest, North Korea is barely on their radar screen. And this is true of both Clinton and Obama. I mean, they're very domestically focused. Clinton has two large Asia camps in her campaign. One is led by Dick Holbrooke, which is kind of the China firsters. you get China first, right first, and then your alliances flow from that. And the other is led by Kurt Campbell, the Center for New American Security, says get the alliances first and your relations with China flow from that. And they're competing, but they really don't have issue-specific people yet, and they've said almost nothing on Korea except for we don't like the Chorus FTA. And then finally, the Obama camp, they're nascent on everything, but they've got a small core Asia advisory group who, in my mind, are all very well-reasoned, but none of them are Korea specialists per se. He also has kind of regretfully, he said, come out against the Chorus FTA, but said almost nothing on North Korea. And so a lot remains to be seen. I think North Koreans would be well advised, and they have been advised. During the Philharmonic concert, former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry of the Clinton administration went and told them, if you want a deal, cut it now. You're not going to get a better deal in the next administration. If anything, this is like that TV show Deal or No Deal. It goes down, right? This is your chance right now. It's not going to get better. Unfortunately, as they used to say of Yasser Arafat, the North Koreans never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And just like they did at the end of the Clinton administration, where they really had an opportunity to make something, they weren't able, or were not willing to go through with it. And I'm convinced at this point, too, we may get some type of a declaration, we'll declare victory and go home, but the fundamentals of negotiating away their nuclear weapons and fissile material will not even be broached until by the end of this administration. This is a problem for the next administration to deal with. So.
Thank you for your questions. Please join me in thanking the panel.